Well, good morning, Mr. Sutherland. It's very kind of you to have come along to give evidence. You're the first in a long series of witnesses who were going to be discussing the EU's global approach to migration and mobility. And it's a great help to have you in your capacity as advisor to the Special Representative to the UN Secretary General on this subject, and also, of course, with your background, both in trade policy and also at the Commission, where you and I suppose I have to declare an interest, did have many dealings in the long-distant past. As you know, the session is open to the public. A webcast of the session goes out live as an audio transmission and is subsequently accessible via the parliamentary website. A verbatim transcript will be taken of your evidence. This will be put on the parliamentary website. And a few days after this evidence session, you will be sent a copy of the transcript to check it for accuracy, and we'd be grateful if you could advise us of any corrections as quickly as possible. And if after this session you wish to clarify or amplify any points made during your evidence, or have any additional points to make, you're welcome to submit supplementary evidence to us. Perhaps I know you would like to make a brief opening statement, and that would be very welcome to the committee. So could I perhaps invite you now to do that, and then we'll move on to the questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Lord Hannay. Well, first of all, let me say that I'm honoured to have been invited to give evidence to you today. And I was anxious to make a preliminary statement because I want to make it clear that the experience that I've had in this area is linked, but not directly, to the development of the European Union position. I have some views on the latter, but perhaps I should first of all briefly explain how I am engaged in this. In 2005, Kofi Annan contacted me and said to me, in effect, that one of the 2 or 3 great global issues of our time was the issue of migration and migration policy, that there were no proper structures, multilateral structures, for the discussion of migration policy and the creation of connections between countries of origin, transit and destination, that there were bilateral agreements, bilateral discussions. The IOM, whilst by its name purporting to be an international organisation for migration covering all aspects, is not within the UN family, and not everybody agrees with everything that the IOM stands for or its constitution, although I must say it's been extremely helpful to me. So he asked me, in the context of a 2006 high-level dialogue taking place in the General Assembly, to look at the issue, having had the experience of being there at the foundation, so to speak, of the WTO, to see what might happen in the area of international discussions on migration policy. I took on that particular task and discovered that there were a couple of fault lines that made it very difficult to make progress. On the one hand, there was a group of countries, which I must say I had full understanding for, who had a significant reluctance about the creation of an organisation within the United Nations dealing with migration, and therefore that road was not one that could possibly have been acceptable to a significant number of member states of the United Nations. The second issue was, well, if it is not possible to proceed by way of setting up a structure within the United Nations, what can be done? And the conclusion that we came to was that it might be possible to set up what was to become the Global Forum on Migration and Development. The Global Forum on Migration and Development, as you'll see from its website, was set up with the agreement following the high-level dialogue by the General Assembly, and it was no more than a structure for annual communication at a 4 or 5 day conference, which would be held alternatively in countries of destination or origin, and that this discussion would take place on the invitation of a member state. And each year since 2006, the Global Forum has taken place. And it has moved from north to south throughout that period. In the south, we've had, for an example, meetings in Mexico and the Philippines, to take two obvious examples of countries of origin. And 160 countries normally attend. During the interval between the Global Forum meetings, we have set up a structure in Geneva which is made up, first of all, at its head by the troika of countries, the country that is currently hosting, the preceding host, and the subsequent host. And that troika provides a sort of governing structure. Under the governing structure, there is what's called a steering committee. The steering committee has been formed by member states who have shown a commitment to the process, and the United Kingdom is one of those countries. And we meet in Geneva once a month or so with the steering committee to prepare and develop papers and proposals for the annual meeting, which will take place this year, for an example, in Mauritius in November. The European Commission has been particularly helpful to this process, and I think that they perhaps see it as something that naturally fits in with the global approach to migration and mobility. And this nexus between development and migration was a key element in getting this proposal across the line in the first instance in 2006. And the reason I say that is that there were a number of member states, including particularly at the time the United States, who were absolutely opposed to any initiative relating to migration taking place within or under the umbrella of the United Nations on grounds of concern about sovereignty. With the change of administration in the United States, that position has incidentally changed in the interval, and the United States is now part of the steering group. And therefore, we have virtually the whole global community working in this process. We have another high-level dialogue coming up next year, which in the United Nations, which will map whatever route there may be into the future. And that will not include, in my view, the creation of a UN organization for migration, because the will for that, at least, has not been demonstrated, and a large number of countries would oppose it. But the structure, which I won't go into and bore you with, of the Global Forum, has become concrete. We have a small secretariat. We've been supported by some NGOs and foundations. For an example, the MacArthur Foundation. We've been helped by various countries financially, including the United Kingdom, but purely voluntarily, not on the basis of any quota. And that support mechanism has become something that takes place it takes place annually, and those who've provided support have not backed away subsequent to their first initial engagement, and have continued supporting financially the operation of the Global Forum. At the Global Forum meetings, finally, countries between north and south and transit origin and destination meet and often create bilateral connections and policies for the development of where they are going and what they are doing. I should say in parentheses that it's not clear to me, and this is at a very early stage, that the European Commission, who in my opinion has done an enormous amount of very valuable work on this, is welcomed even as an observer by all member states in the Global Forum. The key element of the Global Forum is that it is state-led, state-directed, that it will not result in binding resolutions or binding requirements in regard to conventions or otherwise, but it is a forum for dialogue. There is currently some debate, therefore, as to what role, if any, the Commission, in terms of its actual engagement, can play. I personally would think that the Commission should play a role, if only as an ideas factory, so to speak. The final point I would make, and I'm probably going on far too long, but the final point I would make is that we've tried to do two things to create greater coherence in regard to this process. First of all, we've tried to bring together, under a thing called the GMG, the Global Migration Group, all of the UN agencies who have an interest in this, who normally operate in different lines of activity. UNHCR, IOM is part of this, even though it's not in the UN, IOL, and so on. To get them, the original idea was that they would combine sufficiently to create the secretariat that would operate and run this whole operation. Because of internecine warfare between these, they haven't functioned effectively. In fact, it's been appalling, in my opinion, the lack of engagement. Well, there's been engagement, and some of them have been extremely helpful. IOM, World Bank, UNHCR in particular, but they haven't come together effectively. The other point I would make, finally, is that we have instituted a number of things that are related to domestic policy, which are of some value. One of the key issues, it seemed to us from the very beginning, was the lack of coherence in national policy. And one of the reasons for that was that there wasn't a mechanism, often in many member states, to bring together different departments, all of which had an interest in the area of migration. In fact, the field was often occupied solely by those in charge of border controls, departments of justice or home affairs, and other relevant areas, including foreign affairs, social welfare, development, and so on, were not there. We asked, therefore, each country to produce a focal point. And the focal point was to be an individual in a relatively senior position in each member state who would try to draw together in some coherent way at national level, because we certainly couldn't do it, a response to the various initiatives which we were trying to take. And that has worked to some effect. We've recently had a professionally conducted assessment of the whole operation to date, conducted in all the member states, with all of them replying to what we asked in regard to assessing the value of this whole process, and it got an overwhelming thumbs up. And not that that necessarily proves anything, but I think it certainly gives an indication of some degree of support. Virtually no country in the world, and they're all now engaged in it, think that this is a waste of time. They all think it's worthwhile and valuable. So that's my background, and my personal capacity in this, insofar as I have any, has been related far more to process and getting a rather complicated show on the road and working out the way that one might do it, far more than the substance of the arguments, which I believe are, of course, of great importance to the world, as to whether migration is or is not a good thing and how it should best be conducted. So I'm sorry if I went on a little long, but I think it's important to limit the context with which I probably am able to help you, although I'm quite happy. Like most of my race, I talk at a great length at the drop of a hat, and any subject or question you might ask me, I'll try and answer, however inexpertly.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Actually, I thought that was exceptionally valuable, because you have really set the scene in a way which none of the written submissions we've had have done, and I think I personally have gone up the learning curve quite a long way as a result of your explanation, which was admirably clear. Could I just ask one or two process questions before we get into the substance? The meeting in Mauritius in November,
yes,
it will be very valuable to us to have the outcome of that, the public outcome of that. If I could ask if the Secretariat, our clerks, could be in touch with your office so that you could let us have that. It's going to be a bit tight because we're trying to finish our report by Christmas.
Yes.
But it should be manageable, and I think it will be very valuable to have that. Secondly, could you tell us who the British focal point is of your system?
I was afraid with your rapier like mine that would be the first question you'd ask, and I haven't got the name. I should have the name. I don't.
No. When I say,
I don't actually
personally deal with them. But
I will certainly let you know,
because we will probably want to ask him or her to come and give us some evidence about that. And thirdly, did you say that the Commission was not very welcome at the things? Does that mean
to some member states?
Are they there or are they not there?
They're not there.
They're not there.
They're not there. at the last meeting, particularly having regard to an interest that the Commission was displaying in regard to providing support, probably from the development budget, for a process which is directly linked, as our discussions may, I'm sure if your discussions have already shown, to development. I asked them to attend, but a special representative of what is, of the UN, of what is a state-led system. I have no power to actually insist on this, and a number of member states disagreed, and I'm talking about there's certainly opposition within the European Union. What that's based on, whether it's based on an ideological position or not, or where the UK stands on it, as this only arose at the last meeting, I don't know. I should finally say that at the Mauritius meeting, which the UK is playing a role in developing, and the UK has been very constructively engaged with this whole process from the beginning and very supportive of me personally. The 5 days that we have in Mauritius, the way that we run them, I should tell you that finally, is 2 days with an NGO dialogue. Bring NGOs together in an organised way, the host country providing an NGO leader who will bring together the NGO community, and they come from all over the world, and they speak for 2 days on an agenda which is meant to feed into the state-led process that will follow. On the 3rd day, you have a common space where the NGOs communicate with the governments. And then the last 2 days, you have a purely intergovernmental discussion on specific themes relating to this. There's often a debate on this, incidentally, as to whether, as we're meant to be discussing primarily development and migration, whether issues like human rights are directly related to this or not. That has now largely been overcome, and it is generally accepted that human rights is a relevant issue and should be included and not excluded from this discussion.
Yeah, well, we'll follow up, if we may, the Mauritius point and the name of the British focal point, but we will, of course, follow up ourselves directly with the government, their attitude towards the Commission's attendance at these meetings. Lord Richard.
I just wanted to know what the agenda was.
Well, the agenda of the Global Forum is an agenda which covers a whole range of different subjects, all of which, well, for an example, the whole issue of brain drain. It deals with the issue, and one of the first issues we dealt with, and I think we've made significant progress on, is the issue of remittances. We're looking now at the issue of diaspora involvement in the development of national economies and how we can engage them. We look at the issue of human rights. There would be, at each meeting of the Global Forum, there are at least 20 different tables and discussion groups with professional papers produced for them, which cover the whole spectrum of issues relating to migration. Every issue you can think of is discussed, and at the end there's a report on it. And at the same time, bilateral connections are created between countries to try to create partnerships, which again is relevant to, I think, to the idea of the global approach to migration of the Commission. I'm sorry I can't be more precise, because it is general and it covers everything.
Well, I think if we may, we'll go into the questions, which we've given you some advance warning. And the first one I'd like to seek your views on is what your view of the EU's global approach, that's to say the document we're looking at, the latest iteration of the input from the Commission on the global approach to migration and mobility. And how do you see that as fitting in, if at all, to the UN's approach to the problems and the dialogue that you're conducting?
Well, I think first of all that the global approach is in many ways, as far as I am aware, the most outward-looking and cooperation-oriented approach that exists in regard to migration in the world today. Of course, it doesn't address every challenge and opportunity posed by migration, but its basic premise is fundamentally correct, and that is that almost every aspect of migration demands cross-border cooperation among states and the key stakeholders. No state, in other words, is an island and can be an island. And the UN's approach to migration is very similar, at least as I've tried to describe it to you. However imperfect what we have done is, it respects state sovereignty and the right of countries to determine who and how people cross their borders, within the bounds, of course, of international law and international obligations. But it also seeks to foster cooperation, as I think the global approach to migration of the Commission does. So I'm generally very positively, and in fact, I knew less about it, not that I'm any expert now, before I prepared for this committee than I know now, and I must say the more that I've read it, and I have two collaborators who are more expert than I, who are also volunteers, one in New York, and are experts in migration, and though I'm giving hearsay evidence, they also think it is admirable.
Lord Tomlinson.
Sutherland, you said in your introductory statement, I think I heard it correctly, that there were ideological objections, to the European Commission participating in your global forum. In view of what you said about the Commission proposals for the global approach and the praise that you've heaped upon it, it would be very interesting to know what the ideological objections are.
Well, I don't know precisely what the objections are, but I think that they broadly fall under the heading that one of the key elements of the global forum is that this is a state-led process, and that the European Union and the Commission, the European Union itself in the first instance, is not, in this context, in the views of some members, not an appropriate party to be afforded significant rights. There is
but they're going to accede to the Council of Europe, they're going to accede to the Court of Human Rights, which is, the Council of Europe is a body of member states, but they've overcome the difficulties in relation.
Well, I absolutely agree with that, and I completely agree with you. And I have made I had better not refer to the state that I know is leading the opposition to this, which is not the United Kingdom, but last weekend I spoke to the foreign minister and I spoke to another minister in regard to it, and I made the points that you've just made, but there is a...
And they, of course, have status.
And there is one other argument that they would make, and probably, although I don't think it stands up either, which is that if you open the door for the European Union, then other bodies which are not as constitutionally structured as the EU is might also claim. And how would you draw a boundary between the African Union and...
Yes. Known as the objection of the dangerous precedent.
Yes.
Which, along with the unripe time, is at the call of all civil service objectors to anything, as you know. Lord Mackenzie.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. Mr. Sutherland, in your recent talk at the LSE, you noted that migration must be a more robust part of Europe's foreign and development policy. How might this be achieved?
Well, first of all, what I was getting at there was the fact that migration, as I said earlier, tends to be in the domain of the Home Office or Interior Ministry, and occasionally of migration or labour ministers, if there are designated migration ministers. And at one level, this is entirely sensible, given the importance of maintaining border security and so on, and of addressing labour market needs. But migration is not actively considered often as part of foreign and development policies in many member states. And what does this mean? It's not an argument for greater or lesser migration. It simply accepts that migration has happened and that it will continue to happen. And insofar as it does happen, we must consider its implications for development and foreign relations. It is therefore an issue which goes far beyond the boundaries of the security issue on the state. A great many European countries already have immigrant populations that are proportionately similar to those that exist, for an example, in the United States. Many have an immigrant population which is over 10% of the foreign-born population, in countries such as, obviously, the UK. But in my own country, in Ireland, we had virtually no immigrants and very many migrants, as everybody knows. But we now have 766,000 migrants, making up over 17% of the population, and far more than that in the major cities. And that has all happened in 10 years. Now, I'm not making a point about Ireland, but it's a graphic illustration, even in times of great stress, economic stress. And incidentally, over the last 3 years, that population has increased, not decreased, with the immigrants leaving and going back to their countries of origin. Quite the reverse. So it's a phenomenon which is everywhere, even in countries which have difficulty. And we need to therefore consider the relationship that migrants have with their countries of origin, and see what, if any, policies could serve to amplify the development impact of their engagement. More than 350 billion in remittances is sent back every year from migrants. And the cost reduction in that has gone from an average of 15% to 8% as a result of some efficiencies, and could go far lower than that. And the result of that is that an extra $25 billion is reaching the rightful recipient of those funds. So the migrants, therefore, and migrant policy, I'm rambling a bit, is something which it should involve consideration of issues like that, as well as simply how many get in or how many don't get in.
To some extent, my question relates back to what you said at LSE, and I had the privilege of being there to hear you say it. It also relates back to your extremely interesting introductory statement. And if I may say so, I was particularly cheered to hear your observations about the need within member countries to bring the variety of departments who have a stake in migration together to see the implications for each department of migration policy rather than just the Home Office or whoever it is. My question is this. To some extent that you have covered it, of course, but my question is this. Within the European Union, there are two objectives. One, which seems to be pretty deeply rooted in European institutions, is a commitment to development in the poorest parts of the world. Another is the policy which is emerging certainly in member states, including our own, that immigration should be more targeted towards the people who are needed to help the economy of those member states be efficient. There is potentially a contradiction in this, because of course the people who are targeted for immigration may in fact be people who are most needed at home to help in the building of a better future for the people of those countries. How do you think the Commission can help to reconcile these two objectives and to make sure that one is not contradicting the other?
Well, first of all, the argument of targeted migration, and let me in parentheses introduce this as you, Lord Judd, as a governor of LSE will be more than aware, and the whole issue of migration into third level education is not an irrelevant issue in this, and the visa program is something that I would be deeply worried about in regard to both academic staff and students coming into the United Kingdom and the effects that will have. And that's not unrelated to what you're saying, because the reality is that migrants, many migrants of the targeted type with particular skill sets, and the evidence is clear on this, and for an example, the United States, are migrants who have come in as students And they have become capable of making very significant contributions to the societies of destination because of education and because they come in. But coming to your fundamental point, I don't think that there is a great deal of evidence which suggests, although it's a popular theory, that giving particular priority to skills which are absent is a desirable approach to migration and excluding those without those skills. And in fact, in any of the European societies, and I think this probably reading their papers, they would speak for themselves as the Commission's view, the evidence is that the gaps in employment are often, and right across the European Union, are often those at the lowest skilled level rather than the top skills. Now, there are other examples as well. For an example, in Germany, there are over 50,000 jobs in the engineering sector which need to be filled. That can be replicated, I'm sure, to a lesser extent in many other member states. But I don't see that there is an argument in favour of limiting migrants to areas of high skill and contribution through high skills into an economy. Apart from everything else, people move from one level of society to another in a properly organised democratic society. And lots of people who may come in who are unskilled may, as I've said, even without the benefit of going to third level education, may well move up the scale. But I think I've missed your point. What could I ask you again, Lord Judge?
Well, I mean, is there anything specific that you would suggest the Commission should be doing about this?
I have no immediate answer to that as to what the Commission should be doing. I mean, it should be articulating ideas, but I don't see that it has any direct role in regard to the member states and their policies on this particular issue, other than through discussion and exhortation.
But you would agree that it's an issue which the Commission ought to watch very carefully?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the Commission's thinking on this whole area is really quite advanced, and it has the massive advantage of not being swayed by populism, which inevitably in many more directly political environments become a relevant factor in the enunciation of migration policy.
And you would say that...
If I could just come in, if I've properly understood, you're really saying that you don't think that the EU as such, or its member states, should be adopting policies to prevent a brain drain from poorer countries to the more developed ones, nor should they be developing policies to promote a brain gain. You're really taking a very free market approach to that. Is that, have I understood that rightly?
Yes. Yes,
I thought that was what was...
Yeah, no, that is correct. I think the brain drain concept, incidentally, is hotly contested. At the most basic level, I think that individuals should have a freedom of choice, and therefore you cannot say we're excluding all of this category because it will have a negative effect on the society from which they come. Nonetheless, it is true that certain developing countries suffer a dangerous outflow. For an example, in skilled doctors in Mali, I know is an example that is often cited. And we have to be vigilant about not doing anything that actively reduces these stocks. But I think the operative words are actively reduce these stocks. I mean, I think that that there is a distinction between actively engaging in soliciting individuals and giving them the freedom to make the opportunities that are available to them, make the most of them. But also it must be said that the brain gain doesn't necessarily involve poaching workers. It could be the product of a smarter approach to certifying the skills of migrants who are already in Europe and who are taking jobs beneath their training. Doctors driving taxis in London, for example. So there are a number of things that could be looked at in this regard.
Well, Thomas,
you would argue that ministers, when they are deliberating these issues, should very much have the points you've made on their agenda. And similarly, does that not suggest that the Commission might facilitate thought in this direction by promoting some paper, some research into the implications of existing member country policies for the overall strategy of the EU?
Oh, absolutely. I absolutely believe that, and I believe that the cooperation between the member states, rather than each developing a policy in isolation on a whole range of migration issues, is fundamentally important, and the Commission has to be the catalyst for that and the thinking behind it. I'm just saying that in the end of the day, the legal authority of the Commission to interfere with the policy in regard to selective migration into a country, however much one might wish, some might wish it otherwise, doesn't, I think, exist. So there's only so much that can be done. I'm not arguing against the Commission's engagement. I think it's vital, and I think we need a lot more cooperation between member states than we have.
I think you partly answered the question that I was going to ask Mr. Sutherland, but my question really is, how can the EU ensure that immigration control objectives such as border controls and readmission agreements, how can they coexist with development objectives, and is the current balance about right? But you also specifically mentioned education as one of the areas, and I asked what thoughts you might have about the UK target of reducing net migration, which is the target that how they're measuring the target, from tens of thousands, to tens of thousands from hundreds of thousands, and the impact that is having, particularly on higher education, where incoming students are counted as economic migrants and are therefore, quite often deterred from coming here because of both the difficulty of getting visas, and the perception that they're not welcome.
Well, taking your last point, I know that LSE takes this issue terribly seriously. Of the educational establishments in this country, there is hardly a university that could compare in terms of the total number that we have from outside the European Union within LSE. And it's also true, and if anything, I think I'm correct in saying that it is considered to be equally important that the academic staff should not be exclusively from within the European Union, and that it's very important that we should not send a signal from this country either to potential student applicants of the highest quality or to academic staff that this is in some way an unsympathetic environment in which to seek visas or whatever other permissions or requirements are necessary. And I would be fearful that that could be a signal that might be given of a society which, as an observer and somebody who resides in the UK, as coming from outside the UK, I've always viewed and still view as a most tolerant, open society which has been welcoming to migrants. So I think it's very important that that signal should not be given. Even at the more mundane, practical level, it will be massively damaging to the third level education sector in terms of the resourcing, both intellectual and indeed financial, that results from huge numbers coming to this country, and many staying, as we have found looking at the graduates who come through LSE. Many of them stay and contribute substantially to the United Kingdom.
You're probably aware that one of the reasons the government gives for treating university students as economic migrants is because they pray and aid a guideline issued by the United Nations so long ago that I can't remember when it was, which says that anybody who stays for a year is an economic migrant. they seem to ignore the fact that most of the UK's competitors in the higher education sector, like the United States, Canada and Australia, do not apply this guideline at all. And secondly, that the guideline, of course, has no mandatory or legal application. I imagine you're familiar with that aspect.
Yes, but I think that the argument has no substance whatsoever. And,
absolutely, I agree. I mean, I've looked at, as an old UN hand, I've looked into this, and it frankly doesn't hold water.
No.
This is not a piece of international law.
No, absolutely not. So I mean, it provides no justification at all for the position that we're talking about. So I agree.
Lord Avebury. Sorry, yes, it is Lord Avebury. Sorry.
Yes, this leads into my question, which is about domestic politicization of immigration issues across Europe. And what do you think of the prospects for multilateral initiatives on migration? Do you really think it's possible for the EU to speak with one voice on migration, as the Commission's communication on the GAM proposes? And how do you think that could be achieved?
First of all, there's no doubt that there are differing attitudes to migration and different elements, for an example, in the member states of the Union at present in terms of attitudes to it. We have seen in some of the most liberal societies in Europe, to our surprise, to everyone's surprise, the development of political parties who have a significant role in governance, who have policies which could only be described as racist. And the difficulty of bringing about a full agreement between the member states of the European Union on issues like migration, which are so toxic, apparently, politically, is difficult, I accept, to achieve. Having said that, the degree of cooperation that can be required, can be developed between the member states, can have an enormously beneficial effect on the level of domestic debate on important issues relating to attitudes to the development of migration policy. And I think that the EU, through its expertise and the experience that it has throughout the European Union, can be of great help in developing common positions. But I do accept that in the end of the day, as I said earlier, it's difficult to see the EU as the instrument at present which determines the law at national level in significant respect in regard to third-party country migrants.
I wonder if the Global Forum could have some influence on European policy in some of these respects. And for example, I'm thinking of family reunification, where the rules are different between various European countries and may be affected, as you say, by the development of racist political parties in some of the member states. But I mean, is it possible for the Global Forum, or has it in fact considered the question of family reunification and the need for countries which are receiving primary migrants to allow spouses and dependents to come in on the same basis? Because surely in the European Union it would be extremely incongruous to have widely different policies between one state and another in whether or not they allow spouses and dependents in and under what conditions they're to be allowed in. So, I mean, for instance, is it possible that the Global Forum, amongst the papers that are produced for discussion, would consider the question of family reunification? Because if they did, it might have a profound influence on European thinking.
Yes, it is a subject that has been discussed and will be discussed. I think that a far higher percentage, as I understand it, of immigrants to Europe come through the family reunification path, so to speak. That is, they're not selected for their labour market qualifications, and thus, sometimes it must be said, struggle to find work. But having said that, the humanitarian aspects and the requirement of an open approach to family reunification is something which is discussed and I think is a very important element of the Global Forum's debate.
Did you say that it had been discussed in the Global Forum? Is it?
It has been. It has been discussed.
What's the status of papers that are produced for the Global Forum?
The status of the papers produced by the Global Forum are not conclusions or decisions because it's a non-decision making body. And a number of member states have been that has been the crucial element in the debate about what it is and where it's going, because the normative end is considered to be completely off limits by a significant number of northern or countries of destination. They won't allow it. So all that the Global Forum does, I don't want to make claims for it that it cannot live up to, is it provides a forum for discussion rather than decision. I mean, for an example, the Domestic Workers Convention, which I very much believe should be adopted, and I can understand why it might be adopted, has not been adopted by many, ratified by many member states, including the United Kingdom. But whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, the Domestic Workers Convention or any of the other conventions relating to migration is not a subject which the Global Forum is allowed to discuss.
Are the documents that are discussed at the Global Forum on a website? Or
Yes.
They are?
Yeah.
So we could ask our clerk to visit the website
yes, yeah.
and see whether there's anything relevant to these. Good. Baroness Pressure.
Well, to some extent you touched on the question that I'm going to ask, but it will be helpful to hear from you a little bit of detail. How do you think the EU should cooperate with other international organisations, including the United Nations?
I think that the EU should have a role in that cooperation, as I indicated earlier. But I think that there is a significant barrier to it, and that is a number of member states oppose the idea of the European Union playing a role, including a role simply as an observer in the Global Forum. It was an observer status that was objected to. I find that hard to understand, to be honest with you. But and that's what suggests to me that it's a hardline ideological position, which is related to and I should say that one member state, which is a very great supporter of the whole process, is one of the member states which objects to this. So I think it's not related to any desire to hamstring the Commission or the Global Forum itself from discussing issues. It's simply a position that the European Commission should not play a role in this type of discussion. I'm hoping that we will. I've addressed the Council on one occasion, it must have been about 5 or 6 years ago, on the issue of the Global Forum, and I'm hoping that that opportunity will arise again in the near future.
But I imagine it's not totally absent from the concern that if the European Union speaks with a single voice at the forum, then the legal implications of that within the European Union, given the various rulings of the European Court of Justice, can lead to a kind of reverse leverage. I imagine that's probably one of the reasons, but like you, I cannot quite see why that applies to the Commission being an observer at the meeting, which doesn't seem to me to create any competence at all.
No.
But anyway, it's something which we will certainly need to look into among the many other aspects we do.
Can I just ask a question? You did say in introduction that the EU has been quite helpful.
Yes, been tremendously helpful in the background.
In what ways have they been helpful?
Well, they've been helpful in papers, in ideas, in discussions with the small group that is trying to keep the show on the road, so to speak. They have now indicated, and they have in the past provided some financial support, and I think that they may provide a lot more. I mean, the argument in terms of the development part of the nexus between development and migration, is that it can really be argued that development funds, and I think the Commission have taken this on board, that development funds available to them can be spent in smaller amounts with greater effect through the development of policies around the world, in Europe in particular, of course, which link the diaspora, circular migration as an issue, the diaspora bonds, for an example, are being discussed. The World Bank has come through the Global Forum to talk about the idea of diaspora bonds, which of course has been massively successful in the case of Israel, which is sui generis, but it has worked in other cases. And also the whole idea of governments and countries having a role in using the diaspora, or helping the diaspora to link in to industry in their home country, and circular migration falls into the same issue. So the Commission has played a big role, I think, in the intellectual formation of some of the ideas.
So if I understand you right, there is a dialogue at an official level, but there is an objection, them having the status at the forum itself.
They have no status in the forum itself,
but the dialogue
and their influence is via the conduit of member states rather than directly into the global forum, because the global forum has no existence other than myself and two collaborators, really, and the organisation of the structure is around what I explained: the Troika, the steering group, and the general membership of the UN.
Something we need to explore.
Lord Sharkey.
You mentioned that migration into Ireland had increased, perhaps counterintuitively, over the last few years of economic stress. And I wondered what your general view was of the impact of the global economic and financial crisis on transit migration. I'd also be interested in your views on the impact that demographic trends are having, or likely in Europe, having or likely to have on migration patterns over time.
Well, I mean, if one looks at the key arguments and issues relating to migration and the need for migration, the demographic is the most fundamental, and the challenges, demographic challenges in a number of European member states, however difficult it may be to explain this to the citizens of those states, is absolutely unquestionable in terms of crucial dynamic for economic growth. And declining population, aging population is destructive of prosperity, forgetting about the moral aspect of migration entirely. And that's particularly relevant to a number of the countries of Central Germany itself is a major issue, but also some of the southern states. So the demographics are a key element in this debate, and a key argument for, and I hesitate to use the word because people have attacked it, for the development of multicultural states. It's impossible to consider that the degree of homogeneity which is implied by the other argument can survive, because states have to become more open states in terms of the people who inhabit it, just as the United Kingdom has demonstrated. With regard to the evidence in regard to increased or decreased migration because of the economic crisis, there is obviously political evidence that the economic crisis and the development of higher unemployment rates leads to some of the toxicity in national debate, which we've referred to earlier in terms of migrants. High unemployment rates often have that effect, but it's not always the case. The evidence in regard to Spain, for an example, which has notoriously the highest level of unemployment, remains that it is an extremely tolerant society, notwithstanding the fact that it has had, as no doubt children in Spain are constantly taught, 800 years of North African occupation or whatever in its history. But I mean, it's an extremely tolerant society, so it's not everywhere that one finds this. But the strains of economic difficulty and the implications to migration are, I think, pretty clear. But as to the numbers, I don't think that there is evidence of, as demonstrated by the Irish example, there isn't evidence that there's a huge fall-off in migratory flows into the countries which are in difficulties. I don't think that the figures are greatly different today to what they were 7 years ago, when some of the peripheral countries had apparently buoyant economies as opposed to today.
I think as far as intra-EU migration is concerned, there have been some quite considerable evidence in this country of a drop in, for example, Polish and Baltic population here going back again, partly because the Polish economy has been doing rather better than the British economy.
Yeah.
And so that is true. But I think what you're responding to more is
the global
migration from outside the European Union. Yes, Lord Richard.
I was just looking at the notes we've got called speaking notes at the LSE, which I found fascinating. And on this particular point, which was the relationship between, if you like, demographic trends, immigration, and economic development, you make 2 or 3 points to the LSE, which are slightly different, I think, from the ones we've been making today. And I wonder if you could clear it up. I mean, the LSE were quite strong in stating that the patterns of migration are interesting because they're a new pose of attraction. In other words, it's not just the traditional places like Europe and the United States. It's now Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, Mexico, and all the rest of it. At one stage, we said this, and I'm not quite sure what you meant. We said, put another way, we're seeing a shift from states selecting migrants to migrants selecting states, now, that I understand as a concept. As a result, our ability to compete on a global level is at risk. Now, what should you mean by that?
Well, I suppose that I suppose that I was saying that if you have limitations in a society which previously had no limitations in regard to migrants coming in, that you end up depriving yourself economically, if that's the only issue that you're concerned with, of the benefit of the migrants who would otherwise come in, because they have other alternatives. And that the migrant flow between so-called developing countries is itself developing very rapidly, particularly in the ASEAN and other areas. And many of these are people who this society should want from an economic point of view.
But there's no doubt in your mind, then, that migration is an economic plus.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's I think it's a moral plus, but I think it's also an economic plus, and not something to be rejected.
Just one small thing that I'd like to clear up. You talked apparently critically about, quite praisingly, of multiculturalism.
Yeah.
Don't you think that we've had, for a long time, a rather false dichotomy between integration and and multiculturalism?
Absolutely.
They're not choices; they're both imperatives.
No. Absolutely.
Okay.
I'm merely saying that those who argue that that we all have to actually have exactly the same outlooks on everything, I accept that we need a fundamental acceptance of the values and the basic norms.
And the language.
And the language.
Yeah.
And above all, the concept which is fundamental to my mind to Europe, which is the principle of the equality of man and the dignity of man, and all that both of those imply. And migrants have to be prepared to accept that.
Yeah.
But having said that, once that is accepted, it seems to me that the world in which we're going to move, and increasingly are moving, is a multicultural world.
Can I just make a supplementary of that? Is there not a case for sort of self-levelling, natural levelling off between integration and multiculturalism in this country?
I think that there is a tendency to that, and it's probably a very good thing, but absolutely, I think that there is a tendency.
Thank you, Lord. My question is, you referred to the different levels of governmental ability to integrate migration in various other countries in the EU. And I think you also said that the checklist, the questionnaire you sent round, was that among the EU members or the global?
The global forum.
Right. Thank you very much.
I mean, the whole point of the global forum, incidentally, is to make the point that apart from the bilateral approaches, which are fundamental, for an example, to the global approach of the EU, that is not the only thing that you have to look at when you look at migration, because when you look at the migration flows, it is a global phenomenon. It's not simply dealing with North Africa or even sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. It's a global issue, and therefore we need, and that was the rationale behind the Global Forum in the first place, that the US and Mexico are blinded in their discussion. Well, that's an exaggeration, but there seems to be a great focus on the Latin America connection and the dialogue between North and South. But the US also needs a forum, as does Europe, which encompasses more than the neighbourhood policies which are necessary for harmony within a region or between regions.
So my real question is, about the EU, there are obviously different levels of enthusiasm for migration among EU members. And what is the EU's role, in your view, should be to improve the economic and social integration of the immigrants in Europe, particularly the second and third generations?
I think its role has to be to develop within the member states themselves responses which take account of the best experiences of the best of the European states, some of which are making enormous efforts in this area. For example, one could look at Sweden, for an example, where there is a very advanced policy, and indeed Spain has also a policy in regard to looking at the societies and going into the societies from which migrants come to try to adjust them and before they come to what the reality is of the society into which they're migrating. So I think that the EU's role is to bring together the best thinking and to bring the member states together in the best approach, common approach to this issue.
Would you, with your very considerable experience, agree and endorse the data coming from OECD, which suggests that the employment rate of migrants in Europe, across Europe, is lower than within the United States and Oceania? If you do agree with that data, what do you think the European Union should be doing about it, and why do you think it's happening?
Well, first of all, I've no doubt that the data which you recite is accurate. I haven't actually read it, and I don't know the answer to what you're saying. My immediate reaction to it would be no different to anyone else's. I would imagine that if the European example is much poorer in terms of the integration of workers into their society in terms of their getting jobs, that it is related to the fact that the United States or Australia and New Zealand are migrant societies, and that therefore they accommodate more readily those from other backgrounds than we do ourselves, who still nurse a sense of our homogeneity and difference from others, which is precisely what the European Union, in my view, should be doing its best to undermine.
Well, on that note, you've given us a very rich diet today. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a privilege to hear your views on this, and I think you've helped us a great deal in this first evidence session of what is going to be quite a long process. So thank you very much indeed.
So I note that there is a website, but if the documentation is inadequate on the Global Forum website, we can produce it in other ways, so we can talk to secretaries about that.
Committee Room 3, Sound.